The use of 1080 for pest control is a highly controversial topic. The Department of Conservation and the Animal Health Board run pest control operations using 1080. They do this to prevent damage to native plants and animals and to combat TB, which is spread by possums into dairy and deer herds. We went to the West Coast to meet those involved in the fight against the pests causing widespread destruction.
At the moment we're in Kelly's Creek in the Otira Valley. Pest control has been ongoing here since about 1964. It's had regular aerial 1080 operations in the site, and as a result of that it's in pretty good condition comparatively to a lot of other central western valleys. The areas that we look after here in the Otira are about 7,000 hectares. We have full block 1080 operations about every 5 years, approximately 5 or 6 years, and in interim times we actually do a smaller operation, trickle fed areas, much smaller, tighter areas, on areas we know through monitoring where the possums build up to higher numbers, so we can actually knock them and keep the numbers overall very low for longer periods of time. When you think about an acute toxin being used from a helicopter, it sounds bad. It's not something that's intuitive as a good thing to do for your environment. But you need to have a good look at the actual toxin. It's biodegradable, it's a naturally occurring toxin. It lasts for a very short time in the environment, particularly with rain. In the West Coast, you get a little bit of that, so it breaks down very quickly. It's not something that hangs around. For example, here in the Otira, it's been used since 1964. You couldn't find a trace. It's not a persistent toxin that builds up in the environment. If we didn't have 1080 as a tool to use, essentially what it means is our costs for doing control would skyrocket. I mean, this area in here, we can treat this for about $15 a hectare roughly with aerial 1080. If we had to use a ground control technique, and the next cheapest method of ground control in an area like this would be hand laid 1080. So it's the same toxin, it's just a person putting it out as opposed to a helicopter. And that would cost us about $45, $50 a hectare. These are what are called giant carnivorous land snails. These are Poelephanta annectens. On a world scale, these guys are really rare. New Zealand's got endemic creatures that are not found even remotely the same anywhere else in the world. You know, our insects, our invertebrates, really special. That's a pretty typical example of possum damage. Possums always hit them in the same place. It's always just behind the entry hole. They'll chew them out, and they use their incisors, cut through the meat, and then they'll hook out the big fleshy foot, and it's quite a lot of meat. So these guys essentially are a slow-moving nocturnal protein pack, and the possums have gotten on to eating these, which is a real shame. Possums can hoover up about 60 of these in a couple of nights. Our main tool for assessing how many possums are in an area is to use the trap catch method. So we're actually setting possum traps to establish what sort of density there are, and it's done to quite a strict protocol. There's kiwi and there's weka in this catchment in this area, so we need to raise our sets to keep those ground birds safe. So once we've got our traps sorted, we'll put a bit of lure down low because I want the possum to move up this side. And I'll put a little bit more over here. So the possum's going to move up here, and when he reaches this point, he'll step across onto the trap, and then bang, and it should fall free. The two types of aerial 1080 that are utilised in this block, and one being, of course, broad-scale 1080 operation where it's spread out of the hopper over the whole area, but of course more recently we've been trying trickle feeding, which is a method which utilises the helicopter and the bucket, but we take off the spinner, so the bait falls directly below the helicopter in quite a line, quite well-defined line. Now we can pre-feed along that line, and then we can come back and drop the toxic 2 weeks later, right along the same line using GPS technology. It's very accurate. So what's actually happened in that 2 weeks is the pest species, the possums and our rats that we want to target, have moved in and they're foraging actively or more actively in those areas. So you've pre-fed them, you've trained them into those locations. So by doing this, we can actually use a lot less 1080, and it has the same effect. We're actually getting the same kill rates on possums and rats.
Born and bred on the West Coast, farmer Katie Milne is chair of the TB-free committee for the West Coast and the West Coast provincial president of Federated Farmers.
The link with the possum is that prior to now they've been very, very thick in numbers, and we're really islands of pasture and amongst the sea of bush. So possums have been able to come out and interact with the cows in the paddock because there's such a big reservoir of them. So we've had to do something about them because they've been the main transmitter of TB to our animals. And we had well over 250 herds and we're down to the 30 odd, so we've made wonderful progress. And I have to say that is on the back of 1080 being introduced into the program and doing aerials in behind in the big expanse of bush. We have possum control done on the farm fringes, buffer zones as we call them, and that's all done by ground control. But what was happening was after you'd knocked down the possums, within a very short period of time, the massive reservoir of possums in behind allowed leakage of fresh possums to come back in and just reinfest the area. So we weren't really winning the battle because you had a constant supply of fresh blood coming in. Well, the problem with cows is they're terribly curious, and if a possum comes onto the paddock, into the pasture, if the cows spot them, they'll just rush straight up and investigate. So they lick them and pick them up and maul them and just generally sniff them. And so that inhalation, if a possum's infected, they pick up the infection that way because the possum will lie there and spit and carry on and try and defend itself as well, and it transfers it by that method. There is a lot of controversy about the use of 1080 as part of the program. It's an awkward one, it's a very polarising thing, but at least with this report coming out from the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment, it gives the rest of New Zealand and the local population who aren't farmers and the people who aren't really on the green side, it gives them a bit of confidence that this has been really thoroughly reviewed, and when it's used correctly, it's safe enough to use in our environment, and the benefits are huge, not only for the local economy and the farming side of it, the farming sector, but in the biodiversity side. We've seen a lot of change ourselves from the number of possums that were around when we were kids to now. The possum numbers are very low and the bird life is better. And I get very thoroughly frustrated from people who keep continually coming out and saying that the bird life is decimated, because that is just not what I have seen in my own experience. The one thing I'd like to get across to people on behalf of farmers on the West Coast is because of that fact that we're now got the possum numbers low on the back of 1080, we have the opportunity to really nail this thing home and get rid of TB in our herds for good, and then we can be free of all this conjecture and all these issues, and we're getting very close to that point, I feel, in my opinion, and you know, the sooner the better.
This program was made with funding from New Zealand On Air.